A reasonable officer would have seen that this appears to be a point of conflict, would have heard that Mr. Floyd was describing himself as claustrophobic. The reasonable officer on the scene standard is an objective one. We don't just adopt an officer's idiosyncratic subjective perspective. We take the reasonable officer and put them into the actual officer's position and say, what would the reasonable officer have perceived, seen, heard, or believed? In this case, prior to the reasonable officer in the defendant's position arriving on scene, he would have been aware that there was a call, I believe, dispatched about counterfeiting, that the individual was described as possibly intoxicated. The individual later identified as Mr. Floyd was identified as possibly intoxicated, that two other officers had taken the call, had I believe taken someone into custody and called Code 4, identified that they had the scene under control and did not need additional resources.
Now what I'd like to do is turning to the demonstrative 953. Right, you can see the beginning of this use of force evaluation, and you have this divided into different sections. Up top you have threat factors, at the bottom you have foreseeable effects of force. You have the defendant and his conduct up top, activity of Mr. Floyd on the bottom. Is that right?
Yes, the threat factors are really the behaviors of Mr. Floyd and whether they presented any threat, and the foreseeable effects of force are really about the effects of the use of force on Mr. Floyd. Yes.
Now, what I'd like to do at this time is show you a first clip. This is taken from what has been received into evidence as Exhibit 45, beginning at timestamp 2017:40. And you see on the demonstrative here it says defendant arrives on the scene. I'd like to publish that clip first.
Adjust the chair.
You can't win. I'm not trying to win. Go on, get in the car then. I'll be on the ground, anything. Go on, get in the car. Get in the car. He know it. He know it too, Mr. Officer. Y'all hear me? Don't do me like that, man. Please. Okay, can I talk to you, please?
So you get in this car, we can talk.
I am claustrophobic.
I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me.
God, I'm claustrophobic.
Get in the car.
Get in the car. Get me in the front. Please.
No, you're not in the car.
I'm claustrophobic, Mr. Officer.
Get in the car. We're going to pull you in.
Okay. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. You ain't gonna win.
All right. Now, sir, this is taken from the perspective of the defendant's body-worn camera. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
What information would have been apparent to a reasonable officer based on the exchange we just observed?
So a reasonable officer in the defendant's position would have realized that Mr. Floyd was in handcuffs, would have realized that there were two MPD officers already on scene, along with two more now, the defendant and the officer that he arrived with, would have realized that there was what we might call a point of conflict between the officers and Mr. Floyd, who did not want to get into the back of the car. One of the things that signifies is generally that, generally that the individual has been searched. Typically, an officer is not going to load someone into a squad into the back of a car until after they've been searched. As I said, a reasonable officer would have seen that this appears to be a point of conflict, would have heard that Mr. Floyd was describing himself as claustrophobic, would have understood Mr. Floyd to be offering some alternatives, right? Laying on the ground or sitting up in the front of the car, as opposed to being put in the back of the car. In other words, the point of contention does not appear to be police custody, right? Mr. Floyd does not appear to be objecting to being kept in police custody, but instead to be objecting to being put in the back of a vehicle.
Now, you're aware